The 19th Amendment meant that state laws that limited the vote to men were now unconstitutional, and a new door opened to many, many thousands of American women who had been kept from the polls by sex requirements. So it opens a new era of registration and a new sort of election day in November of 1920. The suffrage movement gets right the fundamental idea that sex should have no relationship to political rights or political power in the United States. This is a movement that looks to expand American democracy to include an important portion of the body politic that had been disenfranchised, silenced, and really didn't have a seat at the table in American politics. The suffrage movement also suffers from an important shortcoming, and that shortcoming is its relationship to racism, anti-Black racism. Really, from the outset of the movement, American suffragists struggled with their own personal prejudices, but more importantly, they struggled with how to build a political movement that represented itself as speaking for American women writ large, but actually was deeply ambivalent about opening the door to African American women in American politics. As the movement goes forward and suffragists determine that it's important to bring white Southerners into the movement, to win the support of Southerners, white Southerners in the movement, a deep compromise will result, and African American women will be asked to stand at the margins, will be excluded, but most importantly, their political interests will be jettisoned in a bargain that leads to the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Mm-hmm. African American women will be kept from the polls just like their fathers and their husbands have been kept from the polls by state laws that are used to keep Black Americans away from Election Day. Poll taxes, literacy tests, understanding clauses, and nothing in the 19th Amendment, by design, nothing in the 19th Amendment interferes with the ability of Southern states to continue to use those laws to now keep Black women from exercising the vote. March of 1913, Alice Paul and a somewhat renegade crew of women associated with the National American Women's Suffrage Party convene a parade in Washington, D.C. on Pennsylvania Avenue. They call the parade for the eve of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, and they are looking to draw dramatic attention to the cause of women's votes. African American women earlier in the planning had been invited to participate, but as the meeting drew close, Alice Paul and the other organizers get pushback, particularly from Southern women, white Southern women, who object to sharing the day, sharing the parade, sharing their political lives with African American women. But African American women do attend. Probably 36 or so of them come to make plain that they are going to steer their own political futures, and sometimes that means taking part in a meeting or a parade where you're not welcome. Ida B. Wells from Chicago is one of the African American women who comes to Washington to participate in the parade. She travels with a contingent of white suffragists from that city who have been her allies, her comrades in the struggle for women's votes. by 1913, women in Illinois have gotten the vote to an important degree and are really becoming major political players. So Wells comes, and when she arrives, is advised that she's going to be asked to march not with the Illinois delegation, but with a contingent to the rear of the parade. And Wells is deeply hurt by this announcement, so much so that many people fear she won't march at all. But once the parade is underway that morning, Wells will step out from the crowd, enter the parade already in motion, and link arms with two of the white suffragists with whom she's traveled from Chicago and complete the parade route alongside them. It's a moment that illustrates Ida Wells's genius and tenacity. That's very important. It's a moment that reminds us that there were, particularly in local circles, there were instances in which Black and white suffragists worked alongside one another. That was true for Wells in Chicago. But it is also true, and perhaps the bigger truth, is that the marginalization of Wells and other Black women in that parade is one sign of what's on the horizon, which is an increasingly rude bargain that will sacrifice Black women and their political interests in the interests of building another sort of coalition, a white coalition. It is that coalition that will lead to the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Suffragists like Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are deliberate in foregrounding themselves and their contributions to the long quest for women's voting rights. They publish a multi-volume, nearly 6,000-page history of women's suffrage and place themselves and their allies at the center. So when we ask, how is it that we've overlooked or forgotten or aren't as familiar with some stories, particularly the stories of African American women, well, this is because, if you will, the first history was written by participants who privileged their own roles and their own importance. African American women are organized all throughout the movement for women's rights and women's suffrage, going back to the early decades of the 19th century. They will organize in anti-slavery societies, in churches, in civil rights organizations, in sororities, most importantly, perhaps, in the National Association of Colored Women, which is founded in 1896 and is really a companion organization to the major women's suffrage associations. African American women never organize in suffrage associations, or they rarely do, I should say, because their political agenda is, importantly, far more ambitious. African American women are working simultaneously for the vote, while they are also working, for example, to win anti-lynching legislation in Congress. And so a suffrage association, particularly suffrage associations that are reluctant, if not opposed to grappling with racism, are not an easy or a comfortable home for African American women. So one of the things that I had to do in my work was stop looking so hard at the suffrage associations and follow African American women to where they actually were and where they were doing their work. And we find them in the NACW, the National Association of Colored Women. We find them in Black Methodist and Baptist churches. We find them in civil rights organizations like the NAACP. And so telling the story of African American women in the vote requires that we do a different kind of investigation and then listen to Black women. And it turns out they are as interested in, concerned about, committed to their own political power as any community of American women. They're just doing that work on their own terms. this is why the example from 1920 is so illuminating. In 1920, yes, anti-Black racism is underneath the effort to keep Black women from the polls. But there's a nuance to that. That effort is being led by white Democrats who expect that if Black women register, if they come to the polls, they will, the vast majority of them, support Republican Party candidates. And so what white Democrats fear is that they won't be able to keep their power, particularly in the American South, if Black Americans, including Black women, are disenfranchised. White women are expected to split, right? And if you will, vote like their husbands and their fathers. It's a terribly sexist way to frame it, but that is the language of 1920. But Black American women are expected to come out and vote as a bloc and really change the game for the Republican Party. Well, here we sit in 2020, and we know African American women continue to vote as a bloc in this country. Now, today they vote for the Democratic Party, not the Republican Party, but the fears remain the same, that when Black women are able to turn out, they won't split as white American women did, for example, in 2016, that they will vastly vote Democratic and have the ability to shift the outcome, not only in a presidential contest, that is important, but everyone knows the ways in which the weight of those votes can change local and state level elections. And so there is a very deliberate political purpose to keeping people like Black women from the polls precisely because they vote as a bloc. They will enhance the power of the Republican Party at the polls. And so this fuels the Democratic Party in 2020, the Republican Party in 1920, but they will enhance the power of the Democratic Party in 2020. This is the fear, this is the purpose of voter suppression. I thought it was historic, but I want to say why. Many people have commented on Senator Harris as a first, and I actually think the era of firsts is quickly behind us. And what we're seeing is the force of Black women, of women of color in American politics writ large. That part of what is remarkable about Senator Harris's nomination is that she was part of a pool that included 6 Black women. And they weren't cookie cutter figures at all. They were very different in their experience, in their expertise, in even their position on the issues. This to me is a sign of women of color becoming a force in American politics and not simply shattering glass ceilings or chalking up firsts. So alongside Senator Harris, or somewhere between 120 and 130 Black women running for Congress. That is a force. Those are not firsts any longer. And so I want us to appreciate that we've entered a new chapter in American politics. It's one that Black women have worked especially hard for since only 1965, when the Voting Rights Act is passed, but have worked deliberately for, have built toward, have readied themselves for, such that when this country gets ready for Black women in politics, it turns out there's not 1 or 2 or 3, right? There are a half dozen and probably more that we could name who would have been forceful, right, running mates for Joe Biden. I think we're in a new moment historically, and I'm extremely excited for what this generation of women will do in Washington after they are elected in November. Wow, I didn't know that. Thank you for telling me that. That's awful. What a cynical gesture by a president who is presiding over a regime and coming into a presidential contest in which so many American women will be disenfranchised because of voter suppression and our unwillingness to grapple with the challenges of COVID-19. What a cynical gesture. I'm not an expert on Susan Anthony, but I have to wonder if she might not decline. You know, this is a hard anniversary because there is hard history for us to learn and to confront and to grapple with. So to have that muddied, right, by a cynical, craven act like pardoning Susan Anthony on this day just tells us how hard the work is of truly being committed to reconciling the difficult past and working toward a better future.